Jenna, in your very literate and articulate presentation, you seem to end up calling for the kind of platform that the founder of Reconstructionism advocated. So here we have two approaches, secular humanism and Reconstructionism, which are by far the smallest in terms of numbers attracted. Does that concern you in your prescription for the future well-being?
I'm not so sure that I was prescribing as much as suggesting that we, at all times, remain alert to history, and that there are appropriate models in the past. But I don't, as a historian, I don't proscribe or prescribe. I describe and analyze. I think the problem is that there is a fundamental tension. What I love about Kaplan is his recognition of the impact of emotion and sentiment on the will to Jewishness. That being said, the structural conditions, or to use Shoshana's words, the parameters of American religious culture in this country are such that historically they don't make that a viable option. Does that answer it?
No. What Mordecai Kaplan didn't seem to notice is...
Speak louder, they use the mic.
It seems to me that what Mordecai Kaplan didn't seem to notice was that it was not only indifference that was causing people to stay away from the synagogue, but that there were at that time cultural Jewish activities that more Jews found more relevant to their own lives than what was going on in the synagogue. I mean, there was a whole Jewish labor movement. There were beginnings of this movement, that movement, and much more exciting than attending the synagogue. Does he
Charles,
recognize that?
Respond to that?
Oh, you
No, I'll defer to you.
Kaplan was part of those. He was well aware. He was a labor Zionist. He was arguing at a time when no one else was acknowledging these as legitimate expressions of Jewishness, that these were legitimate. But he, as his thinking developed, what he also, I think, ultimately argued is that if these are to survive, the cultural or secular or humanistic or religious life, however you want to term it, must revolve around what he called sancta. That this was the sense in which he argued that Judaism was not just a civilization, but a religious civilization. And that the sancta of the Jewish history, Jewish tradition, had to be incorporated into whatever formulation we developed. And he, since he could not believe literally the words of the prayer book, he in part changed what he could not believe, but also reinterpreted, reconstructed them. His ultimate central insight, I think, which has not been mentioned, what he called his Copernican revolution, was his realization that, contrary to the traditional view, which was that the Jewish people were called into being to serve the ends of Judaism, so to speak, to serve God's purposes, the reality was the other way around. That Judaism was called into being to serve the needs of the Jewish people, and that Judaism therefore had to be defined as that which served the needs of Jewish peoplehood. I think he argued that for that to have a lasting interpretation, one had to begin with the traditional sancta. One might accept them, one might reject them, one had to come to terms with them in some way, one had to take them seriously. And so he developed a non-supernatural conception of God. Contrary to Yehuda Bauer's formulation, I would suggest there is no supernatural God, and Kaplan, or from my standpoint, Kaplan and Heschel were its prophets. But that one had to constructed out of the materials of Jewish history, that those materials were constantly changing, and therefore there is an ongoing obligation to reconstruct them to meet the needs of the time.
I've heard it said that the suburban Reform Synagogue is the largest underutilized building in America. You want to comment on that?
I'm willing to share.
Well, we have an answer from an Israeli here.
Don't you think that those changes that were suggested by Kaplan, and actually went further than what was suggested here, some of them were not accepted, like the changes of Kol Nidre, for instance, because he realized that a rational, moral man cannot say Kol Nidre seriously and believe in what he says unless he doesn't understand it, and that, of course, that's much easier. Therefore, it is said in Aramaic, where most people don't understand, that they cannot say those things and agree with the prophets, for instance. Don't you think that those changes that he suggested meant that unless the synagogue stops being a place in which people will say words that are contrary to their beliefs, the synagogue cannot fulfill anymore the role that it fulfilled all those years, because all those years it fulfilled the role because it did correspond to the beliefs of people. Now, the secular movement, which is the biggest movement in the Jewish world, although the organized secular movement is one of the smallest, the secular movement includes people who cannot pray, who cannot say those words if they really understand them, if they really mean them. They can say it only if they mumble them and don't understand them. Therefore, in Hebrew, it's very, very difficult to pray in things that you don't believe. Kol Nidre, for me, is one of the most immoral moments in the year of the Jew. Because of the Christian wonderful music that was added to it, it is very exciting for people who don't understand it, and because of the custom, it became an important moment in life, and so many secular Jews come to the synagogue. But I think that the importance of Kaplan's contribution, and it's not important how big the Reconstructionist movement is, but the enormous importance of Kaplan's contribution was that unless Judaism develops, it is doomed to perish.
Right.
And the development means a correspondence with our beliefs.
But more to the point, and that is that I think the greatness of Kaplan was that he thought in comprehensive and not adversarial terms. He didn't say either the synagogue or a culturally literate population or a concert or an art festival, but was able to offer up an integrated vision. And that, I think, at least for me, is why what he has to say is so timely and meaningful and apposite. As he says, you know, there's something essential, willy-nilly, whether you like it or not, there's something essential to the body of conventions, sensibilities, and gestures that constitutes Jewish tradition that's bound up with religion. But it's a part of it. And I don't think he says in the introduction to Judaism as a civilization, which nobody reads, he says that this isn't a cry to abandon religion. It's not a slogan for indifference. It's a formula for change. So I don't know if that answers it. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on Norman's question about the underutilization of the synagogue. I was thinking about the structures as you were talking and taking us through the history of the inner core of the meaning of the synagogue, that even as people were lamenting the disuse or the misuse of holidays, the fact is that if you think about the array of public Jewish institutions into which Jews have made a significant investment, I look at Jewish community centers, and they're essentially built crematorium style for the most part. The only Jewish public institutions that have a significant investment of money is the one institution that we use very infrequently, proportionally to how the other institutions are used. That to me is significant. That is obviously dismissing the conduct as gestural Jewishness or...
I'm not dismissing.
No, I know you're not, but I think that there's a tendency, it overlooks the investment people made and continue to make in this institution. So Yes, I think it is one of the underutilized institutions if we think in terms of utility in the practical sense, to the extent that nevertheless it is the one institution into which people have made such dramatic investments. Clearly there are other utilities. I mean, that, again, economists will talk about utility in many different ways. There's an emotional utility, there's a public utility in the sense of for the rest of the world as to what does this say about us as a people, which is not unlike monuments of other kinds, which are, you know, arches and statues are used for what? They're public statements.
Yes, I have a question from a somewhat different perspective. There was a book that was published last year by two sociologists. Their names were Fink and Stark, who did what they claimed was an exhaustive study of several Christian denominations in America. The book was called The Churching of America, 1776 to 1990. And the conclusion that they draw was that looking, and they have lots of charts and a lot of data and so on and so forth, and claim that this is a revolutionary study, they came to two conclusions. One is that over the history of America, the number of affiliated Christians actually grows, whereas you implied that in terms of the Jewish experience, you implied that it's declining. I'm wondering...
Well, it has declined.
It has declined. Okay, but the more important point that I wanted to raise, more germane to the discussion of this forum, is that they conclude that those religious groups that in effect are most demanding and the least accommodationist are the ones that grow. The ones that are most accommodationist to people's everyday needs and so on and so forth, in attempting to be inclusive and liberal and so forth, those are the ones that hemorrhage. And indeed, they document with several groups that when they're in an upstart demanding phase, they grow. When they become a little more comfortable and established, it's then that they become more accommodationist and they begin to decline. And they're absolutely certain of their study and their data. And I just want to throw that element into the hopper because the direction in which we've generally been tending is implicative of a more inclusive, more accommodationist perspective, and one wonders in the light of this type of study, and in light of the fact that so many Americans, at least, are talking about the moral vacuity and spiritual emptiness of American life, I'm searching for meaning, and so on and so forth, whether indeed the presumptions of accommodationism are the ones that towards which we ought to be looking, rather than the presumptions of demandingness.
Start. Is someone going to gather questions?
Yeah, well, I think at this time what we'll do is we'll take some questions from the floor. Let people ask.
Okay.
It'll be easier.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Did you want to respond? Sorry, did you want to respond to?
What I always thought very interesting when I was a child was that the people who came for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, they wanted to be Jewish. They came to that event. They were part of this gestural Judaism. And when they arrived, they were ready for a really terrific experience. Instead, they were scolded by the rabbi because they only came on Rosh Hashanah. And I found that intriguing. I've learned often people will be scolded who show up, but it's really the people who don't show up that you should be scolded. Now, one of the interesting things I picked up from Egon this morning, obviously, was if we're going to go beyond the donor member to the consumer, we have to take Jews where that's what's interesting about your historical observation. This is what has happened to the Jews. This is where the Jews are. This is what they want. For instance, some of the most successful religious movements in our country are those that sponsor weekends. I know people who go off to one weekend of an intense kind, and it serves them for the whole year. It's better than week after week after week after week. If you bring them to one event that will really turn them on, then that lasts. So what is intriguing to me is here is a group of people who they were prepared, right, to rush in for 2 days, for 3 days, whatever it was. It was a grand opportunity to turn them on. Instead, they were usually scolded about their failure to make any kind of deep commitment. So, responding to Egon and responding to you, I think we're looking into the future. What your historical study tells us is... No. What it tells us is American culture has transformed the behavior of American Jews. And we cannot remake American culture. Therefore, if we're interested in serving the needs of American Jews, we have to take them where they are in some respects. And therefore, it may be the case that if they want to come for Hanukkah, Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, give them a fantastic experience. Don't scold them and let them be inspired by the events.
In keeping of, sort of following that up, in terms of what history tells us, Sherwood says American culture, by your reports and Agon's reports, American culture has transformed American Jews. Yes, but we tend to have a present-mindedness. Apparently, it had transformed Jews in 1900.
Yeah, well, that's precisely the point.
Right. So yes, I caught that. I did catch that. So what we're dealing with is plus ça change, and the point that Max made relative to Kaplan and his writings, that at the time when everybody is buying new clothes and showing up twice a year, there is a wealth of Jewish non-synagogal activity going on. What has changed from 1900 to 1995 is not the twice-a-year Jew, it's the absence of these other activities. And it would seem that our task to reach, apparently we have to reach the affiliated as well as the unaffiliated to have a Jewish continuity, but our task is to reconstruct a 21st century version of the surrounding social and cultural institutions which existed at the beginning of the 20th century.
No, what you need is a kind of Americanization of Yiddishkeit, with all that implied. It was a one-generation phenomenon.
Well, I think one of the reasons it was a one-generational phenomenon, and I'm not quite sure of that, as a third-generation secularist and the grandfather of the fifth-generation secularist, I think one of the reasons for that decline in visibility is precisely your quote from Will Herbert in 55, that at that juncture in the development of American society declared that the only Jewish legitimacy was religion, just as America was about to discover its ethnic roots. And as all of America went searching for its cultural heritage, Jews were told that their cultural heritage had nothing to do with their Jewishness. And so we, right now, are saying to a generation that has been disaffiliated, and that's my contention, that rather than being unaffiliated dropouts, they have been disaffiliated because only this way, my way or the highway, and they've taken the highway. At this point of intense ethnic consciousness in America, we have a generation who says, I ain't got any. I don't have a cultural identity. All I have is a set of prayers that I'm not interested in saying. And before I think we can restore this ethnic identity, we need to know what we're dealing with. What we're dealing with is the delegitimization of Jewish ethnicity. And until the totality of the Jewish establishment, not only its emerita, but its active leadership, the current presidents, the presidents of all the major whatevers, can get up, as Shoshana did yesterday, and say, this trend too is legitimate. It is not illegitimate until we hear those words from on high in Jewish life in this country. Young people will continue to say, there is no place for me.
On a less rarefied note, is that the way to say it? Rarefied note? It just so happens that in 1900, in New York City, on the East Side, there were 20 Yiddish music halls, Friday nights, every Friday night, for 20 cents admission. You can make it that way.
And how many Yiddish newspapers in New York City at that time?
But they didn't come out on Friday night.
No, hardly, but they were there. We will now open questions to the audience. Would you please, when I call on you, would you please stand and really try to project your voice?
I'm Patty Becker. It seems to me, it has for some time, that my generation, I was 50 in 1990, I'm 55 now, and I'm right on the border between the older group and the newer group, younger group. But the baby boomer children grew up in households where there were still Yiddish-speaking grandparents around, where the Yiddishkeit was there, and the sense of being Jewish was there, and their parents, who had been born in the 20s in this country, did not see a need to carry forward the Jewish identification in an affirmative way. They just were Jewish. And because, and maybe in Detroit they went to United Hebrew School, but it was a duty thing, it was not something joyous. And then these baby boomer children grew up and formed the core of what we're calling this unaffiliated Jewish community now, and they don't know how to reach back because only religion has been given to them. But at the same time, there's no consistency in what the ethnicity is either, because many people want to throw the Yiddishkeit out, other people want to bring it back. Some do it as Israeli culture, and we have Sephardic cultures out there. So, how can we form a basis to bring this back together as a culture?
Well, it seems to me that's what this weekend is trying to address. Yes.
How many Christians, how many Jews actively become Christians every year? We have statistics on it. We have statistics on it from 1900 down to today. This is the story. Once you understand that story, I think the type of speech that you gave today would probably be spoken in different terms. This is the question, and Jews never look at it. Rabbis never looked at it. Jews always used to say to themselves, a Jew is always faithful to his flock. False. Once they leave New York, they are not faithful to their flock. And there's a big problem. That problem always existed, and you are just attending to it for the first time.
For those of you who are Detroit Jews, this is very bad news for you.
This is the new version of the Slutzker Rock.
I see. It was
Yes, back there.
the diaspora.
Coming from Canada from a slightly different perspective, and it seems to me that when we're talking about reaching out, one of the things that struck me about what Shoshana Cardin said yesterday is that as she was growing up, the air in the house was Jewish. And I came from a secular Jewish background where the air in the house was Jewish. And every breath we took was infused with a Yiddishkeit which was both historical, cultural, and even though my father was a secularist who did not believe in God, he kept quoting Torah and Talmud. And I'm saying that we had better be careful before we become too accommodating. This is from my perspective from Canada, which is one step behind the United States because our immigration came a little bit later. The bulk of our immigration came a little bit later, so we still have more Yiddish speakers in the community. We still have, I think, more immediacy. There's still a little bit more of that air that we can pass on without wondering. But what scares me is before we become a little bit too accommodating, maybe we have to decide what it is we're going to bring these people when they do come to us or when we go out to them.
Right.
And maybe what needs to be brought is something that while it looks forward also is firmly entrenched in something very, very solid, because it seems to me that what is also happening out there is some kind of disillusionment with North American culture. And I think this danger of being too accommodating is not what people are looking for. And one thing that hasn't been mentioned here is the media. I know that stuff has been going on in Toronto that has been very, very grassroots and very out there. And they've taken the position and they've presented song and they've presented dance downtown, and everybody has come to it. And maybe with all of our talk, we may be a little bit frightened of coming out of the closet and taking it. It seems to me the blacks are celebrating, the Native Americans are celebrating, and the Jews are saying, "Oy vey, what are we going to do next? Why don't we just celebrate?"
Question back there. Last row, yeah. Yeah, you.
Thank you. My name is Alan Malkus. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Conversation I had with some of my companions at lunch returned to me listening to this discussion, and that is, why are we here and what are we trying to accomplish? Are we here to get unaffiliated or disaffiliated Jews into organizations and institutions? Or are we here because, whether it's through that mechanism or another mechanism, we want to preserve Jewish culture and Jewish identity, and we think it's a good thing that there be Jews? Does it have to be by getting them into institutions? Does it have to be, as Dr. Meyer said, by membership rather than some other way? Is it a problem? It seems to be a historical fact going back a century that many Jews don't affiliate or affiliate only extremely loosely. Okay, let's deal with that. It's not necessarily that we have to get them into institutions.
I think the premise of this colloquium is clear. We do not have any vested interest in saving any institution. The purpose of this colloquium is to explore all ways in which to bring a meaningful Jewish identity to unaffiliated Jews, whether that is being a donor, member, or some other way. So there is no premise here that that is the idea or the ideal way to handle the situation by bringing people into institutions. In fact, it may be the case that we have to create extraordinary events that people want to come to. I mean, there are many, many options that we can use.
I hope I do justice to her comments of last night, but I think it was Shoshana Cardin's idea that, in essence, you can't be Jewish atomistically. And whether you're talking about, we say organization or institution, and we conjure up bureaucracy, which always conjures up the adjective bloated. None of that is necessary, but if you can't be Jewish alone, if being Jewish means doing Jewish, and doing Jewish means being with people, even if it's 4 times a year to the kind of celebrations that Rabbi Wein spoke about, it's with other people. And that's some kind of structure is necessary. So there's no agenda, I think, on the part of anyone to sell or build up a given organization or a given way of being Jewish. But it has to be a communal and associative activity.
May I kind of turn that around? And it seems to me one of the questions we need to address is if we believe that survival of Jewishness, Judaism, whatever term we want to use, is significant. The question then becomes not can you have a Jewish identity alone. The question that we are really now grappling with is can a Jewish identity be perpetuated without institutions or rituals of some sort? And if the current institutions or rituals are not satisfactory, then what kinds do we need to create? Where I kind of wanted to take brief issue with Joe before in suggesting that the dichotomy was between making demands on people and being accommodationist. And I would argue that these are not